So this lesson is focusing on fractions and decimals. So my first example is turning a fraction into a decimal. So your first option is to change your denominator to 100. And if that is not possible, because if your denominator is not a factor of 100, then you have to long divide. And so I'm going to show you both options today. So my first example is with the fraction 5/20. So if I asked you to change 5/20 into a decimal. Okay, so I'm going to be able to use my first method in this problem. What I can say here is I know 20 can go into 100 5 times. So I'm going to say 20 times 5 is 100. And what I do to my denominator, I also have to do to my numerator. Notice how I'm just multiplying the numerator and the denominator by 5. So now I'm saying 20 times 5 is 100. Notice I was able to change my denominator to 100 by multiplying by 5. And then 5 times 5 is 25. So now my fraction is 25 hundredths. So now I can easily write 25 hundredths as a decimal. Now my next example is if I had the fraction 5/9. And I need to change that into a decimal. Now my problem is that 9 is not a factor of 100, so I cannot do my first example on this one. I have to go to my second example on this one. So I need to long divide. So I'm going to say how many times does 9 go into 5? How many times does my denominator go into my numerator? So 9 goes into 5 0 times. So then I'm going to put a decimal, and then when I add a decimal, I have to bring down a 0. So I can say 9 can go into 50 5 times. Then I can say 9 times 5 is 45. And I'm going to subtract. And then I'm going to bring down another 0. I have to keep bringing down zeros until I find a pattern or until I get a remainder of 0. So I can say 9 goes into 50, again, 5 times. 9 times 5 is 45. So I'm sensing that I'm getting a little pattern here, but I'm going to go out one more time. I'm going to say 9, I got to first bring down another 0. 9 goes into 50, again, 5 times. 9 times 5 is 45. And I notice that I have a pattern here. I keep getting 5s as my remainder, so I'm going to stop. So then my decimal that I'm given is 0 and 5/10, and well, it's going to be 0 and 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, repeating forever. So I'm going to write it as 0 and 5/10 repeating, so I'm going to use bar notation to put a bar over the number that's repeating. And then this is my final answer. So you can tell here you have two options when you're turning fractions to decimals. You can either A, change the denominator to 100, that's the easiest way, or if you can't do that, I need you to make sure that you long divide in order to get your decimal. So my next example is to write a decimal as a fraction in simplest form. So for example, I'm going to ask you to write the example, so this is going to be example 2. I'm going to ask you to write the decimal 0 and 32 hundredths, and I want you to write that as a fraction in simplest form. Okay. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to change my decimal into a fraction. So I'm going to do that by just reading my decimal. I'm going to read this as 0 and 32 hundredths. 0 and 32 hundredths. I'm going to read it, then I'm going to write it. So 0 and 32 hundredths, so 32 hundredths. I'm going to read it, I'm going to write it, now I'm going to simplify it. So I have to ask myself, is there a common factor between 32 and 100? And I can say yes. The common factor would be 4. So I'm going to divide both my numerator and my denominator by 4. So 32 divided by 4 is 8, and 100 divided by 4 is 25. And then I'm going to say, is there any other common factors between 8 and 25 besides 1? And that answer is no. So I can say that 8/25 is how I write my fraction in simplest form. So again, in order to turn a decimal into a fraction in simplest form, you have to read the decimal, you have to write the decimal, and then you have to simplify your decimal. If you can remember these 3 steps, you will be able to turn a decimal into a fraction in simplest form. So that is it of my lesson on fractions and decimals.